I don't think we can be effective if we don't do this third thing, which is that we've got to stay hopeful. And I know many of you are people of faith, and it seems ironic for me to talk about this, but I really do believe that hopefulness is essential for effective leadership. And sometimes hopefulness is not the same thing as faithfulness. Hope is this thing that's quite different, and I believe we actually have to recognize what dangers are created by hopelessness. I actually believe that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. It is the enemy of effective leadership. Hope is the thing that gets you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is the thing that gets you to speak when other people say be quiet. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists, and we've got to fight against the things that make us hopeless. And if we're trying to make a difference, we are going to be confronted with things that will challenge our hope dynamic. It's just inevitable. But we've got to fight against that. I don't believe there's something in the middle. I actually think you're either hopeful or you're part of the problem. There are hopeful leaders or there are people in leadership positions not leading. And that dynamic has to be part of what shapes, and I know it's hard. I can't tell you what makes you hopeless. I'll tell you a little bit about what makes me hopeless. I live in Montgomery, Alabama, and I'll be honest, I really get provoked when people try to romanticize our history. I don't like it when people talk about the good old days of the 40s and 50s. I don't like it when people try to kind of make this era of enslavement so wondrous, and it challenges me, and I get challenged all the time, but I'm meeting these hopeful people. When I moved to Montgomery, I got called by an amazing woman by the name of Johnny Carr. And Ms. Carr was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she called me up and she said, Bryan, my name is Johnny Carr. I'm in my 80s and I'm still the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and I heard you're a young lawyer just moved to town. I said, yes, I am. She said, well, if you're a young lawyer just moved to town, I'm going to call you up sometimes and I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and listen. And she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. So I said, yes, ma'am. And she would call me and send me places to speak and call me and send me places to listen. And then one day she called me up. She said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. Do you want to come over and listen? We're going to go over to Miss Durr's house and we're just going to talk. You want to come over and listen? I said, oh, yes, ma'am. And every now and then she would say, now, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? And I'd have to explain to her that I knew I wasn't supposed to say anything. And I went over there, and I was there with Rosa Parks and Virginia Durr, a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King, and Johnny Carr, and they were talking, and they weren't talking about the things they had done. They were talking about the things they were going to do. And there was a hopefulness in that conversation that was so affirming, so inspiring, and I just sat there, and I soaked it all up. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me. She said, now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And I turned to Ms. Parks and I said, well, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about mass incarceration. We're trying to do something about poverty. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement. We're trying to help children prosecuted as adults. We're trying to help the mentally ill. We're trying to do something about racial bias. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave. It takes courage to stay hopeful in the face of daunting situations. But it is our hope that will save us. I believe that. Well, I wish I could stop here, but I got one more. It's not enough to get proximate and change narratives and stay hopeful. The fourth and final thing I think we have to do if we're going to be effective leaders, if we're going to create more justice and opportunity, the fourth thing we've got to do is we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. And I hate talking about this because we're human. And because we're human, we're biologically and psychologically programmed to do what's comfortable, which means that to do uncomfortable things, we've got to make a decision. We've got to choose to do something uncomfortable. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against comfort. That's not what I'm saying. And I've tried really hard to not have to talk about this one. In fact, I've done some research to look for examples where justice prevailed, where equality triumphed, where liberation came, and nobody had to do anything inconvenient or uncomfortable. I can't find any examples of that. No, effective leadership only happens when great leaders are willing to do uncomfortable things. And it's hard. And I get that it's challenging. And again, I'm not against comfort. You know, I gave a talk down in Mississippi. The people met me there at the airport. They said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We read your book. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we decided, and we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. So we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn. I said, what is wrong with you? I said, of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those chocolate chip cookies just like everybody else. That's not what I'm talking about. No, what I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in uncomfortable places and you've got to be a witness. I've had the great privilege of representing people and winning freedom for clients and walking out of jails and prisons, and it's been magical, but I will also tell you I've had some difficult moments. I represent people on death row. And several years ago, we had a lot of people facing execution who didn't have lawyers. And my staff and I started trying to help these folks. And I got involved in a case of a man who was facing execution in 30 days. And I quickly learned that he was intellectually disabled. And our courts have actually banned the execution of people with intellectual disabilities. But I went to the trial court, and the trial court said too late. It should have been raised earlier. The state court said too late. The appeals court said too late. Every court said too late. And I couldn't understand it, and I was frustrated. And on the day this man was scheduled to be executed, I was pacing in my office, waiting to hear what the United States Supreme Court was going to do. And about an hour before the execution, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone. It was the clerk of court. And the clerk of court told me that my motion for a stay of execution had been reviewed by the court, had been considered by the court. But the court's judgment was the motion was due to be denied. Too late. I hung up the phone, and then I had to do the thing that's the hardest thing I have to do. I picked up the phone, and I had this condemned man on the other line, and I said to him, I'm so sorry, but I cannot stop this execution. And then the man did the thing I fear the most. He began to cry. And then he began to sob. And within a few minutes, he was just sobbing on the phone, and I was standing there holding the phone, heartbroken. And finally, this man said to me, he said, Mr. Stevenson, please don't hang up. There's something really important that I have to say to you before you hang up. I said, of course. And then this man tried to say something to me, but in addition to being intellectually disabled, he had another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got overwhelmed, when he got anxious, he would begin to stutter. And all of a sudden, this man couldn't get out a single word. He kept trying to say something to me, but he kept stuttering. He couldn't get his words out. And he kept trying, and he kept trying, and he kept trying. And the harder that he tried and failed, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. And before I realized it, I was standing there holding the phone, and tears were running down my face. My mind began to wander. And I remembered when I was a little boy, my mom had taken me to church one Sunday, and I remember this day when we were there, and I was talking with my friends, and there was a little skinny kid I'd never seen before, just standing there quietly. And on the night of this execution, I remember asking that little boy, what's your name? Where are you from? And I remembered how that little boy also couldn't get his words out. He also had a speech impediment, and he tried to answer my question, but he couldn't. He began stuttering, and then I remembered that I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother saw me laughing at this little boy, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came over and grabbed me by the arm, and she pulled me aside, and she said, Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. I tried to defend myself. Even at 9 or 10, I was a little bit of a young lawyer. I said, well, Mom, I wasn't sure what was going on. It wasn't clear what was happening over there. And my mother said, no, you know better than that. And my mother said, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and my mom grabbed me by the arm, and she said, wait. After you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. I sort of rolled my eyes. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and then she grabbed me by the arm again, and she said, wait. After you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy I love him. And she gave me that look. I said, okay. And on the night of this execution, I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I tried to say to him as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, look, man, I don't know. I don't know. I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out. And finally the man got his words out. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me. And then he said, I want to thank you for fighting for me. And the last thing that man said to me was, Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life. He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. And then all of a sudden, I realized something I'd never realized before. I realized why I do what I do. And it was a shock to me. I realized that I don't do what I do because I've been trained as a lawyer. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because it's about human rights. I don't do what I do because it's about law or justice. I realized that night something I'd never realized before, and what I realized is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that it's in brokenness sometimes that we actually understand what it truly means to lead. I began to realize that it's the broken among us that can actually teach us the way grace is supposed to work. It's the broken that understand the power of mercy. It's the broken that understand the power of redemption. And as leaders, we cannot assume that we have qualities that other people don't have. We've got to actually identify with the brokenness of those we are trying to lead. I'm actually persuaded that it's in brokenness that we begin to transcend, we begin to lead. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing that we've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone kills someone, they're not just a killer. And because of that, justice requires that there be leadership to understand what else they are. I am persuaded that in this country, across the world, I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I don't. I am persuaded that the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we begin to deconstruct the conditions that give rise to poverty. And finally, I believe that our qualities as a leader, our character as a leader, our communities in leadership roles cannot be judged by how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. Sometimes as leaders, we're distracted by the big and shiny things, when I believe effective leadership, true leadership, isn't measured by how you treat the rich and the powerful, but it's by how you treat the poor and the neglected. I will end with this. There's a different metric system. For I believe effective leadership has a different metric system. You can't measure yourself how other people measure you. I tell this to my students. I say, don't ever think that your grades are a measure of your capacity to lead. I want people to have good jobs, but I want to also say to them, don't ever think your income is a measure of your capacity to lead. I believe that if we get proximate, sometimes even when it's difficult, if we change these narratives, if we stay hopeful, if we do uncomfortable things, yes, there are moments when it feels like we're being a little cut and a little bruised and a little scattered, but that's how we honor what it means to be a good leader. That's how we honor what it means to be a good steward, a good pastor, a good representative of all the things that we care so deeply about. And that's why I'm excited to be in this space, knowing that there are communities of people around the world who are not afraid to get proximate to the poor. Change these narratives of despair, stay hopeful, and do uncomfortable things. I wish you well in that task and pray God's greatest blessings on each and every one of you. Thank you very much.